The Battle for Moriah by Peter Van Kampen. Chapter 1. "We should be mobilizing now," Ra said impatiently. "Our armies are assembled. Moriah has grown complacent and has no idea about the threat on her borders." "Let me get the girl," Molech said. "Why? The plan will work without her." "Because she's so valuable to him," Molech said. "If we have the girl, we have something to barter with. It's more than that. If we can get her on our side, it'll divide the kingdom, and nothing would hurt Melchizedek more than seeing his daughter with us." "You overestimate your ability to persuade," Ra said. "Besides," Asherah said, "there are people all over the kingdom under my power." Molech seethed impatiently. "Yes, a few commoners." "Not just commoners," Asherah said patiently. "They cannot help themselves, you know. When the battle comes, they will give themselves to me as willing slaves." Molech turned to Ra. "You're right. We'll win either way. But with the girl, think about the symbolism. It would crush him, crush the morale of his soldiers. Even if I could not persuade her, imagine what it would do for our soldiers to watch her get sacrificed." "If you are seen, we lose the element of surprise," Ra said. "Look at me," Molech said. "Nobody will see me in the dark." "All right," Ra said. 2 weeks. We could use the time to make more weapons and to prepare anyway. But in 2 weeks, we march. Girl or no girl." Tobias had never been in the throne room before. He had often visited the castle during festivals or speeches, but had always remained in the outer courtyard. And now he had requested an audience with King Melchizedek on the premise that... He decided not to think about it. The whole idea was too ridiculous. It was a swell of hope and emotion that had carried him this far, and he did not want reason to inhibit his confidence. However, as he explained to Reuben, the head of the guard, his reason for being there, he felt foolish. He looked steadily in Reuben's eyes, hoping to be taken seriously. The guards he had spoken to before laughed out loud before deciding that they must defer to their captain. But Reuben just stared. Reuben was a rough, tired-looking man, though alert. He was badly shaven, and he stared at Tobias, his eyes betraying neither amusement nor disdain. "You've come for an audience with the king?" Reuben asked. "Yes, sir," Tobias answered. "For what reason?" Reuben demanded. I wish to court his daughter." Tobias's neck seemed to twitch ever so subtly as he tried to hold the man's stare. He hated speaking so formally. It felt contrived, artificial, but it seemed to him that must be how courtiers would speak. He heard the guards who had called their friends snickering at his expense. And well they should. He was a poor fisherman, and many would-be suitors of higher rank, prestige, and known virtue had been turned away before. Tobias held his cloth cap tightly in his hands, careful not to wring it lest it betray his nervousness. He had met the Princess Sarah on several occasions and was enamored with her. She had beautiful, long, golden hair, and she would often go for walks in the meadows near the village with only a servant for company, or, as often as not, even alone. The village was peaceful, and she was safe. She would come and sit by the edge of the lake and quietly watch as Tobias cast his nets. Of course, Tobias never had the courage, or rather the audacity, to approach her and attempt to engage her in conversation. He felt shy enough just having her watch him, yet he enjoyed it. It was Sarah who had begun speaking with him. At first, he could only mumble the appropriate courtesies, but as she continued to show such an interest in him and in his work, then in what to her must have been the simple life, and she would laugh at his jokes, and she seemed to sincerely enjoy his conversation. Eventually, his confidence grew, and he found himself deliberately going early to fish, hoping that he would see her on the shore and have a justification for bringing his boat in early. In time, they grew comfortable with each other, the princess and the fisherman. He asked her about palace life and nobility and about all those kinds of things, but she seemed much more interested in his life. One day he had asked her about a duke who had come to the kingdom to ask for her hand in marriage, and had been dismissed. He had a fine reputation, and was wealthy besides, and he was very angry at having been rejected. "He was a decent man," Sarah had said, "but please don't tell others I told you this. He was very vain. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean that he was arrogant, but he was just typical. I mean, he's exactly the kind of guy you would expect a rich man who is well raised to be. Polite and articulate, well-meaning, but superficial. I didn't like the way he treated the servants like they were less than him. I didn't like that the most important thing to him was his ambitions, which, to be frank, were self-serving." She paused for a minute before adding, "I don't want someone like that. I want someone good and genuine and humble and hardworking, sincere, like my father, like you." She had looked at him then intently, her eyes green and brown and deep and beautiful. Tobias felt a rush of excitement and could not think of anything to say and could not hold eye contact, so he just looked out across the lake at the far forest. Soon conversation returned to more mundane topics, like fish and deer, and eventually she left. It had been 3 days since that moment, 3 days where Tobias had thought of nothing else and had decided that perhaps the king would accept him. These fantasies were all well and good in the warm sunshine and on the lake, but now, within the stone walls of the castle, with the head of the guard watching over him, Tobias had to work to raise the same fervor and emotion that had prompted him to come so far. Nonetheless, Reuben gestured slightly with his head so as to say, "Follow me," and turned to lead the way into the throne room. As the doors closed, Tobias heard the guards break into laughter behind him, but he pretended not to notice. The hall was lit by torches and decorated with paintings depicting the great victories of the past. Melchizedek, king of Moriah. Melchizedek, the Conqueror, as he was called, because years ago he had reconquered the kingdom from the dragons and giants and other villains who had taken partial control. Like everyone else in the kingdom, Tobias had been raised on these stories. As a child, he always wanted to be a knight and imagined himself fighting for the love of a damsel in distress, dedicated to principles of chivalry, courageously defending the virtue and goodness against everything vile and corrupt. But in his 22 years, Tobias had never seen any violence. In fact, besides mild squabbles between villagers, the kingdom was almost without conflict. Here was another painting, the great warrior Michael, sword in hand, slaying a red dragon. Michael had been the kingdom's mightiest warrior, next to Melchizedek himself, but Tobias smiled to himself as he looked at the picture and wondered just how embellished the stories had become over the years. The next painting depicted the wedding of Melchizedek with Miriam, a marriage that shocked the kingdom since she was of lowly birth. Melchizedek was portrayed as a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, but with a mature and full beard. It was said that while defeating his enemies won Melchizedek the fear and respect of his people, it was his choice of Miriam that made them love him so much. Maybe it was because she was one of their own. Maybe it was because she was so beautiful and gentle and always joyful that you could do nothing but love her and love the man who treated her so well. Tobias loved his king as well, though he had never met him in person. Every week Melchizedek would stand on the balcony that overlooked the inner and outer court and address his people, exhorting them to live lives of charity and virtue, befitting the kind of people who belonged to the kingdom of Moriah. At the end of the hallway, it opened up into the throne room. The vaulted ceilings, the hanging tapestries, the tall stained glass windows that came to peaks as lancet arches all joined to create a sense of grandeur that was not imposing, but rather felt open and beautiful. At the far end of the room, on their high thrones, sat King Melchizedek and Queen Miriam, who were deep in conversation when Reuben and Tobias entered. They fell silent, and Tobias noted how strange and empty and large the room felt as he crossed it with no one speaking. Upon arriving near the foot of the thrones, Tobias and Reuben each bowed and genuflected, and Reuben said formally, "Your Majesties, Tobias the fisherman, who comes to seek your daughter's hand." Then Reuben turned and left. The king sat patiently at his throne, allowing Tobias to work up the courage to speak. Tobias looked from the king to the queen, who greeted him, saying, "Welcome, Tobias. You may rise. What do you ask of my husband?" The queen smiled, encouraging Tobias to speak. "If it pleases your highnesses, I seek to court your daughter." "And why do you want to marry our daughter?" King Melchizedek asked his subject. "For love," Tobias said. "I've spoken with Sarah, that is, Her Majesty, on several occasions, by the lake and in the meadow. I know that she's very beautiful, but beyond that I admire her humility and her kindness and her integrity. I admire her piety and her devotion to you and her magnanimosity." Tobias stopped, not quite certain if that was a word. The king smiled and asked, "And what do you have to offer my daughter?" Tobias had dreaded this question and looked at his hands, empty except for his hat and worn from years of labor. "I'm afraid, your highness, that I have very little. I'm a poor fisherman, and I live in a small old cottage by the river. It's cozy, and it's enough for me, but I know that it's no place for a princess." Then he raised his eyes again to the king. "But I love your daughter. That is what I have to offer her. I will love her faithfully and her children. I know that I will be a good husband and father, and I promise you, good king, that given permission to court your daughter, I will always honor her as she deserves." There was a moment then of silence. The queen smiled again at Tobias, but then she looked imploringly at her husband, the king. As she looked at the king, Tobias thought he saw in her eyes love and admiration, hope, and yet complete confidence in her king and in the decision that he would make. Finally, the king spoke. "Bring my daughter to me." Soon after, a servant entered, and there behind him was the princess. Tobias knelt once more and bowed his head. The princess saw him and knew why he was there. She smiled now as their eyes met, and she went first to her mother and kissed her before presenting herself to her father. "Daddy," she said playfully, and curtsied before the king as any lady in the kingdom would do. But King Melchizedek laughed and took the princess in his strong arms and placed her on his lap. "Sarah," the king spoke, "this young man here has asked my permission to court you." "I know the man, father, and I know that you will choose well," Sarah said. "What do you think of him?" "I believe," said the king, "that he is an outstanding young man. He's shown his character in coming to me to ask for you, which takes courage, and in admitting his state, which takes humility. I believe that he would make a great husband and father. But what do you think? Does he please you?" "He does, father," Sarah said, and it seemed to Tobias that she was actually quite excited. "I gather that this is the young man you told me about," the king said, and he started to laugh as Sarah nodded while Tobias stood stunned. "Well then," said the king, "I am pleased to present to you, young Tobias, my daughter, the lovely Sarah. And to you, my beautiful daughter, I give Tobias, who I trust will protect and cherish you as I have done." Sarah smiled and thanked her father, kissing him on the cheek. She rejoiced with her mother for a moment before going to Tobias and taking his hand. Tobias beamed with joy, not having expected so much. He'd known the king to be generous, but the king had offered Tobias his own beloved daughter. He too thanked the king and the queen, and then he and Sarah left the throne room. Now, of course, Sarah and Tobias were not immediately married. In fact, according to their custom, they were not even officially engaged. Courtship in the kingdom of Moriah was a time to discern if marriage would be suitable. Though marriage was the hoped-for result of courtship, they were not yet committed. Although Tobias and Sarah knew and admired each other, they had not truly learned to love. So they began spending more time together and learning from the king and queen how to love. "Love," King Melchizedek cautioned, "is no magic. It is a virtue. It often begins as an emotion, becomes a choice, and finally is made into a habit. This time of courtship is your time for developing that habit. But," he smiled and winked at his own wife, "neither should it become merely a habit. There is some magic in it after all." So Tobias and Sarah spent many hours together, open with each other, sharing their hopes and dreams. Tobias showed her how to fish, and even how to clean the fish when they were caught. And he'd tell her stories about his own adventures and those of others in the ships on the Sea of Azalor. "One day," I'll take you there, he said. You'll see for yourself the power of the ocean, which artists and poets try so hard to convey, not to mention the fantastic creatures that live in the ocean, all of whom I'm certain will swim to the surface to get a look at you. He knew he was flirting, and he enjoyed it. Whenever he stopped to think about it, he was astounded to realize that he was speaking to the same Princess Sarah he had so often thought about and revered, not to mention flirting with her. He showed her his cottage with its humble fireplace, wooden furniture, and simple table and food. She in turn showed him the castle, with its many courtyards, grand ballrooms and libraries and gardens and sumptuous feasts. Tobias got to know many of the regular courtiers, the king's advisers and his messenger, and Reuben, the captain of the guard, and the other guards at the doors who would quickly begin to show him deference. Tobias struggled with feelings of inadequacy as he knew that he could not give to Sarah all of these things she was accustomed to. But Sarah would remind him, "My father can give me all of these things and more. He could also have chosen for me a suitor who could have given me these things. But he didn't. He gave me you. He chose you because he saw how you would love me. And Tobias, I too choose you." It was after one such conversation, as they walked on a mountain trail, that Tobias asked Sarah to be his wife. She consented, and they went rejoicing to tell her parents. Queen Miriam kissed them both, saying to Tobias, "Tobias, you are my son, and I love you." The king then blessed them, and they set a date for the marriage. Chapter 2. Those next few days and weeks were the happiest that Sarah had ever known. She was accustomed to being given good things from her father, and yet none of these things had ever given her as much joy as her husband-to-be. As for Tobias, he lived up to his promise to love Sarah as she deserved, honoring her and cherishing her. When they would forget and be angry with each other, they'd forgive each other and love each other all the more. One day, while Tobias was out fishing on the lake, Sarah went into the courtyard garden. This was a hidden garden surrounded by a high brick wall, given to her by her father when she was very young. "This place," the king had said, "will be a place for you to be alone and quiet." And it was more than just a quiet place. There was a stream and large old trees and flowers of every kind, and she felt that this beauty was hers. She had told Tobias about the garden, but she had not yet shared it with him. One day she would. But on this day she lay on the grass and enjoyed the sunshine as clouds floated by high overhead. Birds and squirrels kept her company, and goldfish swam in the places where the stream pooled. Sarah loved to come here on a quiet day and just be quiet and think and enjoy her surroundings. But this day she heard a noise that she had never heard, a low rumble. It reminded her of the purr of a cat, and yet it was larger, deeper, and more hollow. She felt some fear, and yet she was in her garden, so what could there be to be afraid of? As she looked, she saw lying under a willow tree a dragon. The animal was large, larger than a horse, though its body was close to the ground. Its knees jointed outwards. Its head was long and flat, like that of a serpent. She had never seen a dragon before, but she had seen pictures and heard stories. The dragons had all been kicked out of the kingdom long ago by her father and his armies. The dragon watched her, its eyes wide. She felt afraid, and yet it did not seem angry, but sad. She began to pity the animal. She saw further that it was very beautiful, as its scales, black at first glance, flashed different colors in the sunshine. It breathed heavily and sighed. Keeping her distance, Sarah spoke to the dragon as she would to a dog or a cat. "And how did you come to be in my garden?" she asked. The dragon raised its head and tilted it somewhat to the side as a puppy would. The dragon smiled and spoke. "I flew." And with that it spread its great leathery wings. Its wings looked very much like that of a bat, and Sarah withdrew somewhat. "But," Sarah said, "you can speak. I just thought—" The dragon stood and approached the girl, who suddenly seemed very small. "Who told you that only humans spoke? Surely not your father. Has he deceived you? No, there are many creatures much more wonderful than humans that speak." But of course, her father had never told her that they can't speak. She knew the old stories, and they spoke in the stories. "I just didn't expect... I've never met one," Sarah said, embarrassed. "Haven't you?" The dragon looked at its clawed hand. "Maybe that's because of the cruelty of your father, who banished us all from his kingdom. We live now in wastelands, deserts, and gnarled forests filled with thorns. It is always dark where we live, and hot or cold. It is never comfortable. Well, if my father has banished you, then why are you here? Sarah challenged. My father is the king, and everyone must obey the king. Must they indeed? Asked the dragon, its forked tongue darting between its teeth. Have you always obeyed him? You never thought for yourself? Maybe you never wondered if perhaps your father is lying to you. Or maybe he's just old. He's ruled a long time now. Perhaps he grows foolish as he grows old. How can you say that? My father is good and strong and wise. Is it wisdom to banish the finest of your servants? Remember, there are many of us, legions who have been banished from your father's kingdom and sent to the dark places. We only wanted to help him to be an even greater king. And now I, a dragon, once honored as one of the wisest and most noble creatures, have to creep like a vermin into the very kingdom that once honored me. Have you ever wondered why we were kicked out? Since she was a child, she'd heard stories of great valor, heroes fighting the dragons and defeating them. The dragons were deadly and to be feared, and yet, now she wondered. Here was a beautiful dragon in her own garden, and it clearly meant her no harm. What is so dangerous about this creature? But the dragon arched its back and stretched, opening wide its jaws in a yawn. You'll never really learn the truth until you learn to doubt your father. I can show you things that your father has never shown you. How? Ride on my back. I can fly and I'm fast. You'll see more today than your father has ever shown you. Sarah was reluctant, and yet she'd always been trusting. No one had ever deceived her before or sought to hurt her. After checking to see if anyone was watching, she agreed, but only for a moment. The dragon bowed its head and she mounted it, sitting right over its shoulders and clinging to its neck. The dragon took a few steps to be out from under the trees, and in a quick movement it spread its wings wide and began to fly. Sarah held on tighter to the dragon. It felt cold and thick-skinned and smelled like a snake, yet her fear of falling made her hang on. As she looked out and felt the wind on her face, she saw the ground far beneath her, and she felt a thrill. The dragon rose and dove and made loops in the sky. Sarah began to feel comfortable with it, and began to enjoy the ride. At first, the dragon flew out behind the castle where there were tall mountains and deep forest, and it would not be seen. But when it came near the village, Sarah hid herself. Don't let me be found out. What would they say if they saw the daughter of the king riding on the back of a dragon? The dragon grinned and said, Your secret is safe with me. They flew over the mountains of Tantar, and she saw their majesty in a way she never before had. They flew over the wide stretches of plains in the Midlands, and watched the little people far below as they collected their harvest, working in the fields. Silly little people hard at work, she thought. They have no idea what is above them. Finally, they flew out over the ocean. She saw the great ships and the powerful waves, and the dragon flew low, and creatures of all kinds came to the surface of the waters to see the princess on the dragon's back. But before she could get a good look at them, they saw the dragon's claws and quickly dove deep beneath the surface. This is amazing, Sarah exclaimed. Tobias had promised to show these things to me, and look, won't he be surprised to know that I've already seen them? But you can't tell him, the dragon said. Tobias would not understand. His whole life he has heard the lies of your father and his servants. No, this will have to be our little secret. Sarah felt strange about the idea that she'd have to keep this secret from Tobias. Would Tobias reject her for it? She hated the idea of having a secret since they'd been so open before, and she would be even more so after they were married. But she realized the dragon was right. Tobias might reject her, and worse, may tell her father. The stories about the dragons were that they were evil and traitors. In the years during the war, men might come under suspicion for even speaking with dragons, and so laws were made that to make a deal with a dragon was an act of treason, punishable by banishment. Sarah realized suddenly that in all likelihood those laws were still in place. On the one hand, the laws were created during a time of war, and the war had long ended. But her father was known for being someone who always obeyed and enforced his own laws, although when it was a question of punishment, he might be merciful. Sarah knew that she could trust her father to be merciful with her, but she did not want to be presumptuous, and she did not want to have to tell him what she had done. Suddenly she felt a sickening feeling like she had betrayed her father. "Take me home," she said quietly. The dragon returned Sarah to her garden, and she got off its back. "Thank you," she said, and curtsied timidly. "Will you stay here in my garden?" To Sarah's relief, the dragon shook its head. "I can't. Remember that your father has banished me, and so I must leave and return to the wastelands. May I return?" "I don't know," Sarah said. She felt deeply conflicted. She wanted to see the dragon again and to ride with it, but wanted to be faithful to her father. "If anyone saw you, maybe if you came at night?" "You will put us both at risk, if we were caught or if you told anyone." "I will not tell anyone. I have as much at stake here as you." Then, realizing that if caught, the dragon would be killed, Sarah added, "Almost." "Tomorrow, then. I will come tomorrow night after dark, and you may ride me." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "I'll see you tomorrow." And the creature flew away.